Hi, and welcome to Minds of Mountainfilm at the Telluride Mountainfilm Festival. I'm Maya Albanese, and I'm here today with Tim DeChristopher, the co-founder of the organization Peaceful Uprising and famous climate activist. Thank you for being with us here today, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So when someone asks you now, why did you go to jail? What's your response?
As brief as possible. I usually tell people that I disrupted a BLM oil and gas auction in 2008, where they were trying to auction off public lands outside of Arches and Canyonlands National Parks without doing their due diligence. So I registered as a bidder and outbid the oil companies, and then made it clear that I was there as an active protest. And that kicked off a 2.5-year legal process that ultimately ended up in me being convicted of 2 felonies and serving 2 years in prison.
So last time we had you here at Minds of Mountainfilm, I believe you had been convicted of a felony, but you hadn't yet served time.
Right.
So now that you've served your time, how has your perspective changed, or what is different for you after that experience?
Well, prison turned out to be not nearly as bad as I expected. It was certainly inconvenient, frustrating at times, but it was far from horrible. The people that I met there were pretty much like the people that I've met everywhere else in my life. And it was a pretty reflective environment. I think what changed in me is kind of a deepening of my understanding of a lot of social justice issues. You know, my time in prison was really 2 years that I spent with one of the most oppressed populations of people in our society. And so it definitely deepened a lot of my understanding by hearing a lot of their stories and getting to know those folks that are on the inside. When
you got out of prison, what was the first thing you wanted to do?
Have a beer.
Good answer.
Yeah, wish it was something deeper, but
makes sense.
I went for the beer.
So this year at Mountainfilm Festival, you have a film called Bitter 70. Mm-hmm. Can you explain the significance of that title and what was the message that you were hoping to get across by making a film about your experience?
Well, I didn't make the film. George and Beth Gage, some local filmmakers from here in Telluride, made the film. They connected with me in early 2009, about a month after the auction, and have been following the story ever since. And that film actually premiered here last year at Mountainfilm. And this year it's just kind of a side thing. It's not actually an official selection this year. They just had their theater opening in New York last week, so it's going through the theatrical release. The title, Bitter 70, it's BIDDER, because that's my bid card number. I was number 70.
So how has Bitter 70 been received over the last year? I imagine for every person who considers you a hero, there are also people who maybe don't agree with your methods. So how do you respond to critics?
I haven't had much interaction with critics. Most of that seems to be on anonymous internet comment boards, but the people who interact with me face to face, even when I go and speak in very conservative areas in Utah, Wyoming, all over the place, I generally get a really positive reaction, even from people on the opposite end of the political spectrum. I mean, I've had a lot of folks come up to me and say, I don't agree with a lot of your policies, I don't, or even like, I don't agree with climate change, but I really like what you did, and I like what you say about holding the government accountable. And I think there's a personal story there that a lot of people can connect to, regardless of what their political beliefs are. And I think the Gages did a great job of telling that story through the film, and I think that's what a lot of people connect to. The Gages said that they did a screening here in Telluride with the tourism board, where a bunch of corporate execs were invited into the screening. And the Gages almost didn't want to come back for the Q&A because they were afraid of, what all these corporate execs were going to say to them. And they said they got an extremely positive reaction, and that people were moved by the story and wanted to talk about it. And that's been the reaction that they've gotten with the film everywhere that they've taken it. They've taken it to a lot of festivals around the country, in West Virginia, Georgia, places like that, and have always gotten a warm reaction.
For those of us who either don't want to or cannot spend time in prison to make a difference or to make a change in the system, what would you recommend as a maybe smaller action that each of us can take?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to get involved, and we need a lot of different kinds of tactics as a diverse movement. We kind of need to put pressure on that power structure that's standing in the way of the changes we need to make. We need to put pressure on that in every way that we can, and in every part of that system. We need economic change, we need energy change, we need political change, and so I don't really tell people this is the kind of thing you should be doing. Because nobody's ever solved a climate crisis before. Nobody has all the answers about what we need to be doing. I just encourage people to think creatively, to take the opportunities that they see, and most importantly, to feel empowered that they're part of a bigger movement, to not just act as an isolated individual, but act knowing that however they stick their neck out, there's going to be a movement there to support them, to amplify the power of their actions, and to carry them through. I do think we have a real social movement now at this point that is vastly different than what we had a few years ago. And it's a movement that really holds people in an important way. And I hope that empowers others, who see that to feel like they can take some risks and step out and take some actions. And I understand that not everybody can go to prison, and not everybody needs to. I mean, even in movements where civil disobedience has been a big part of their success, it's still a small proportion of the people in that movement who go to prison, and that movement is a very small proportion of society as a whole. But there's other things that I would consider to be just as big of a sacrifice, if not more.
Such as?
I was encouraging somebody to run for Congress last night, I'd go back to prison, but I wouldn't go to Congress.
Yes, to each their own methods, right? So when you were in that moment where you decided to become a fake bidder in that auction and you decided to commit an act of civil disobedience, were there role models or inspirations throughout history that came to mind that were part of your motivation to use the tool of civil disobedience?
Yeah, definitely the civil rights movement played a big influence on my thinking. At that time, in 2008, I was actually studying U.S. social movement history pretty in depth. That was one of my classes that fall at the University of Utah. And I was learning a lot about how change has happened historically in this country. I was inspired by the civil rights movement. Alice Paul from the women's suffrage movement was a big influence on my thinking because she came along at a time where the women's suffrage movement for decades had been organizing in a kind of polite way, and almost at times a kind of self-disparaging way, where they were almost begging for their rights. And they'd done a lot of outreach, they'd done a lot of public education, and I think they had built up sort of a lukewarm support in the mass population. A lot of people in the middle that were kind of saying, yeah, maybe women should get some rights someday, without any tangible successes. And then Alice Paul came into the movement and really said, we need to start demanding our rights, not just begging for our rights. And she led the movement in much more confrontational actions. She led protests outside of the gates of the White House at a time when that was very rare, and it was unheard of for women to be doing it. And women were getting beaten by the cops, they were getting arrested, dragged to jail. Alice Paul did a hunger strike in jail and was force-fed by the prison guards. And that was a really shocking image for the country at the time, and forced the country into a choice. And there was no longer this kind of lukewarm middle ground, but people had to make a choice of whether they were on their side or not. And they had dramatic change in a relatively short amount of time then. Just a few years they got a constitutional amendment. And I kind of think that the environmental movement is sort of in that same position, where for decades there's been a lot of general education, there's been a lot of outreach, and we've built up this kind of lukewarm middle support of people who say, yeah, we should have clean air, and we should, reduce our fossil fuel use somewhat, and we got a lot of people recycling and stuff like that. A lot of that lukewarm support that isn't making a tangible difference. But I think if we force the country into a choice right now of whether we're seriously going to defend a livable future for our children, I really think the country's going to come down on our side.
What's an issue we should be aware about or we should be protesting right now?
The Keystone Pipeline seems to be where the climate movement has really drawn a line in the sand. When that campaign was first launched, when Bill McKibben was talking to me about it before he launched the campaign, I said, I'm not sure that's the best target. But it turns out that's what people have gotten into now. That's where we've drawn the line. And it's really the first time that the climate movement has drawn a clear line in the sand like that and said, we're not going to give any ground, we're going to stop this. And I think it's important that we win that. I think if we win that battle, if we stop the Keystone Pipeline, it really drives a wedge between the Obama administration and the fossil fuel industry. It breaks the ties there in the same way that I think the Freedom Rides broke the ties between the Kennedy administration and the segregationists in the South. The Freedom Riders forced the Kennedy administration to take a side on an issue that they had been reluctant to even talk about. Up until that point, the Kennedy administration was not a supporter of civil rights. It was something they tried to avoid talking about. But once they were forced to take a stand, then all the other successes of the civil rights movement, in a way, became inevitable because it had fundamentally shifted that political balance. And I think we're at the same point right now.
So what's your next career move?
Well, I'm traveling a bit with the film this summer, and then in the fall I'll be going to Harvard Divinity School to study to become a Unitarian minister. Interesting.
What is the connection between spirituality and spiritual development and civil disobedience and what you've been doing in the past?
Well, I really see this as an extension of my previous activism, not a change in direction. All successful social movements have had some kind of spiritual foundation that has provided the faith that they needed to carry through a long movement. And in my time as an activist, I've seen that a lot of the things holding us back are really spiritual issues, that on most things we have enough information, we have enough resources, but there's something internal that's holding people back from taking the kind of actions that they know are necessary. And so I'd like to address those issues, and I feel like being in the ministry actually gives me more freedom as an activist than I would have working as a professional activist. Working for an NGO or something like that tends to funnel people into a very tight focus on a certain slice of an issue. And I feel like the strength that I bring to the movement is looking at things more holistically and articulating a bigger vision. So I think I'll have more of an outlet for that as a minister.
Great. Well, I wish you luck on your path, and thank you so much for your continued contributions to Mountainfilm.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.